understanding BrickerBot, Pascal will show us the evolving details of this malware and tell us what we might see in the future. Please welcome Pascal to the S4 Europe stage.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. Really excited to be here. Really nice conference. This is the first time we're going to talk about, or in public, about BrickerBot. So I discovered it like a couple of months ago. Did a last blog post about 2 weeks ago. And this is the first time that we actually bring it to public. So I'm going to start out with a question. Suppose that you go out to an online web store, you buy a shiny new webcam, you put it on the internet. How long will it take before it will be compromised by an IoT botnet or IoT malware? How long do you think? Who thinks 1 day? More than 1 day. Who thinks more than 1 hour? More than 30 minutes? 20 minutes? 3 to 5 minutes. So when you put an IoT device, an unsecured IoT device on the internet, it takes 3 to 5 minutes before it's infected by an IoT botnet. A couple of minutes later, after it's compromised, BrickerBot comes in and bricks it. So in a couple of minutes, like 30 minutes, you have your device pretty much useless. It's become a paperweight. So before I set the scene, or before I start talking about BrickerBot, I want to set a scene. And I want to talk about different actors that are out there in the IoT landscape. And we did research, or I did research on IoT botnets because we are a DDoS protection company. And Mirai was one of the first IoT botnets that changed the landscape of DDoS attacks. So it was an inflection point for us in October 2016 when Mirai came out and did the attacks on OVH and Krebs and Dyn. So and from there, we saw some couple of evolvements. And there was also Hajime coming out. So a couple of weeks after the release of the source code of Mirai, you had Hajime coming to the scene. But 2 days after, you had the big Dyn attack, which actually put Hajime back in the background. But it stayed there, and it built its botnet for a long time. So now we are out there with a big botnet of Hajime. We will see later what it actually does. And then, like in March 2016, I discovered lots of different servers across the world and devices attacking me in my honeypots with bricking commands, specifically designed to break Linux BusyBox-based devices. So typically what those unsecured cameras and modems out there that are compromised by Mirai and Hajime are being used and abused and exploited by. So last thing that comes in the cast is the janitor. So a couple of weeks after I discovered BrickerBot and reported and alerted on it, somebody came out of the dark and called himself the janitor, and he is the author, or claims to be the author of BrickerBot. Now, we're pretty sure that he is the author, and he claimed that he already bricked like 2 million devices since October 2016. So here's a story about BrickerBot. So first of all, before I start, I want to start explaining you how it's possible that those IoT botnets compromise devices and how easy it is to compromise those devices, and what made the janitor so angry against IoT and against those devices. So first of all of the botnets, Mirai, Hajime, also BrickerBot, they all use the same way to compromise the device. That's actually doing just a telnet. A telnet and using factory default credentials. So now you know you take your camera, you put it out on the internet, you go to the web interface, to the GUI, you put in an admin name, you put in a very secure long password, and you think, OK, now I'm secure because I put in a secure, long, good password. Well, no, you're not. Because by default, the telnet service is activated, and it's using a different user database than the one that you use through your GUI. And in most of the products, you don't even see the usernames that are in that separate database. So that means that your telnet is open, and it's using different default credentials than you already know. Maybe if you go look deeper in the documentation, if you go search in the forums, you might find that for CLI access, there's a different default user that you can use, that you can log in, and that you can change through the CLI. But that is after researching. So most of the people don't even go search that far. That made it possible for Mirai to compromise hundreds and thousands of devices across the world and to use them and weaponize them and create big DDoS attacks back in October 2017. So here is an extract of all those default passwords that were used by Mirai. Mirai was not the first one to use it. There have been IoT botnets long before Mirai, but Mirai was the first one to also be open sourced and that we can exactly know how many of those passwords were in there. So here's a list of 61 passwords. We will see with Hajime, which is much more sophisticated than Mirai, that there's more to add and that there's more exploits. So this is one way of doing it. Now, once those botnets get access to the device itself, to the IoT device, in order to compromise it or to infect it, it's fairly easy. It just runs a script, just a couple of commands that it does, and one of those commands is making sure that it gets a privileged shell by enable or shell. So there's a couple of commands, gets a privileged shell, looks for a writable file system. After it finds a writable file system, it will try to detect the platform. Which is it an ARM platform, is it a MIPS platform, so that it knows which malware to download. And to do that, it takes the first 52 bytes of /bin/echo. So it copies this echo command, looks at the first 52 bytes, and using that, it knows exactly which platform it's targeting. And using that information, then it will just do a simple wget or TFTP or netcat and download the binary, change mod it to executable, and execute it. And that's it. So fairly easy. And all of them, this is now an example for Hajime, but Mirai does exactly the same. So those are the command sequences that you will see coming in that compromise your devices. First, it brute forces telnet, and then it runs a sequence of commands that infects the device. And at that moment, malware starts to run. Now, there's another infection vector that has been used, for example, during the Deutsche Telekom attacks last year. So remember that Deutsche Telekom, November last year, suffered 900,000 modems that went offline because of an attack. Actually, it was a failed attempt. Failed, quote, quote. Luckily that it failed. Yeah, I have to say luckily, not luckily for Deutsche Telekom, but luckily for us it failed, because if it would have worked, it would have meant that 900,000 devices would have been infected by a malware that can be weaponized in a weapon for mass DDoS attacks. 900,000 is like something of the scale that we did not see before used in an attack. Now, it didn't work because the modems rebooted and they were broken and disconnected from the internet. So it caused like a denial of service for them, yeah? But the actual attack itself failed. And the way that it was used, or the exploit vector used during that attack, was not a telnet, but was using the TR069 protocol, which is an XML-based protocol for LAN site management of modems. However, most of those modems that were in use at that time use a specific server that is, when it's installed, it's non-secured, so there's no user authentication, and it runs on all interfaces. So that means that it's not only on the LAN side of the modem that is being exploited, but also on the WAN side. And it's not being filtered. So that means that anyone who knows this TR069 protocol and finds a vulnerability in there is able to exploit lots of modems from ISPs and carriers around the world. And that's exactly what happened. So there was a remote command execution vulnerability in the new NTP server field. And by putting in a command string, you see the command string out there, cd/temp, and then download the malware the same way as we used for the telnet, but now we just put it in as a field value for the new NTP server using that TR069 protocol. And by doing so, it executes and it downloads the malware, infects the modem. Now, there's lots of modems out there. 900,000 modems from Deutsche Telekom were attacked in this way. This is only 5% of the residential connected market. So imagine the number of devices out there that can be impacted by this. Now, it's not only cheap cameras, because most of the time we talk about IoT devices and we look at those cameras and we point the finger to the cheap cameras and the Chinese constructors and the big manufacturers that actually build boards and give them down to downstream manufacturers and then assemble a camera, put the label on it, and sell it for €100. Well, there's actually some cameras out there that cost $3,000 to $4,000, even more dollars that you can buy, and that are not much better off in terms of security. Here's an example from Sony, the Sony IP-ELA cameras, and that was a backdoor that was discovered by a local company here, SecConsult, back in October last year, and they found that there was a backdoor installed. Now, the way that they found it is because they were able to download the microcode. It's a good thing to provide updates to your users and to be able to download microcode, but it's a bad thing if you don't encrypt your microcode. So anybody who has access to that microcode can just decompile it, find out how it installs, what it does, and by doing so, they could find that there were actually 2 OS-level backdoors in there. So default passwords that can be used and abused by anyone to get access to the camera. The researchers think that it's some backdoor that Sony put in to give remote support. Yeah? Typically not the best idea to serve your users. Well, actually, this was discovered end of last year, but when I did a search for that hash in that password file, so to find out if this hash was already being prompted on the forums to be able to find the password behind that hash, I actually found that as early as October 2012, the first appearance was there in a forum. So somebody was already asking in October 2012, does anybody or can anybody help me to find the password that matches this hash? So that means that this guy already found the backdoor 4 years ago. Yeah. Even before we found it. So, and the cameras were announced by Sony on March 2012. So that means that in a couple of months, this guy found this backdoor, tried to get in, and tried to get access to all those cameras. So in 4 years' time, this guy could have built a really, really big army of cameras working for him. So why are IoT botnets so important? And what is the state of the internet? If you look at the internet today, more than half of the internet traffic is built up of bots, bot traffic. Now, there's good bots, there's bad bots. It's like 50-50 between the good bots and the bad bots. The good bots are the ones that are indexing the internet, like Google index searches. Yeah? Also, when you go to travel sites or hotel booking sites, they scrape different sites, do price comparisons, provide you a service. They make the internet work as we know it today. But there's also a lot of bad bots out there. Not only IoT bots that perform attacks, but also scraper bots that take information from websites, who automatically order into system, so put in orders, fake orders, to deplete the stock of other computers or other vendors. Now, this is the bot thing. Now, why the IoT? Why is the IoT such an important part in this whole story? Well, IoT, for one, is 24/7 available. If you look at the classical way to infect PCs or to create zombies to perform DDoS attacks was to use Windows PCs. You infect a Windows PC. Infecting a Windows PC is actually much harder than infecting an IoT device. We saw how easy it was to infect an IoT device. Infecting a Windows PC, you need to do a phishing campaign. You need to have the user click on something to install it. Once it's installed, it does command and control, but you need to hide that to escape firewalls and to escape all kinds of sensors that are out there looking for bad traffic. All of this does not happen in IoT. If you look at Mirai, it's a very basic bot. All it does, it uses Telnet as an exploit, and to do command and control, it just creates a TCP connection, sends commands in clear text, says ping, pong, and then you send the command ATK, just name the IP address of the server, and how long to attack that server. It's just clear text. There's no evasion techniques, there's no encryption, there's no protocols like DNS being used for command and control. It's very, very basic stuff, which makes it so easy to build for anyone, and so easy to build large botnets. So we all know that most of the IoT things, and I'm talking about a specific category of IoT things. It's important to know that I'm talking about Linux BusyBox-based things. Yeah? I'm not talking about the embedded devices or the pacemakers or the very small ones with microprocessors. I'm talking about the ARM-based Linux BusyBox-based ones. Yeah? So modems, IP cameras, we saw. There's DVRs, DVR recorders typically are using that. So those are the categories of things that are being targeted by those IoT botnets. Now, the first I already talked about, Mirai, is very unsophisticated. So if you look at Mirai, when you have an infected bot, or better, an infected device, that bot starts to scan around himself, trying to find new victims. So it does a SYN scan on Telnet. Once it finds a victim, it will do a brute force login. It's very efficiently written. It can do up to 500 brute force logins per second. Yeah. Once it finds the account, the username and password to breach a new victim, it will not itself infect it. It will actually send it up to a scan and listen service, and that service will send it on to a load service that will infect or load the bot onto the device. So this is the command sequence that you see come in your honeypots when it's starting to download the malware. Once the malware is activated, it will in itself also start scanning. It means that it grows exponentially. Every node is scanning for new victims. Once it finds a credential for a new victim, it's a central service that does the loading. It's very efficient and very good to create large botnets in a very limited time. Now, it also has command and control, and as I said, it's clear text command and control. Nothing special about the command and control. Even the default source code was using port 23. Yeah? So that means that those devices are publicly exposed on the internet. Yeah? No security at all. Now, if you look at the milestones for Mirai, so on September 20th, Krebs on Security was attacked by Mirai, which was actually not the real. If you look in the history of Mirai, and Brian Krebs made a whole lot of articles on Mirai because he was affected as one of the first by that botnet, you see that the reason for Mirai, or the reason that the author built Mirai, was actually to attack Minecraft servers. You know, Minecraft, the gaming that Microsoft acquired. Such a gaming server can run like $100,000 revenue per day. So there's a business there in protecting gaming servers from DDoS attacks. And the guy who wrote Mirai was one of those competitors in those DDoS protection services. And he was using Mirai to attack his competitors and to win more market for him. So it's just a simple story of money again and attacking competitors. So you had the Krebs on Security, which was actually somebody who rented, because the guy who made Mirai also rented it out to other people. And somebody who rented his botnet attacked Krebs on Security. And then the author started thinking, this is not a good thing. He knew and he respected Krebs as a security reporter and an investigative reporter. So he knew that Krebs would not let go. So he said, I need to do something. And what he did is actually put out the source code. That's why the source code came out. He put it out there, tried to make a smoke screen, have everybody adopt that tool, have lots of attacks from Mirai across the world, hoping not to find him. The attack on OVH, well, it was not OVH, so the French hoster OVH, that was the target. Actually, they were hosting a Minecraft server inside. So that was the reason that OVH was attacked. Now, those attacks were all large numbers, so 620 gigabit per second volumetric attacks, the biggest attacks that we ever saw. Also, OVH, large number of devices. Octave Klaba said about 1 terabit per second. We're not sure about that traffic, but it certainly has the potential for 1 terabit and multiple terabit traffic volumetric attacks nowadays. And then, just a couple of days after the source code, or 1 month after the source code, we had the attack on Dyn. And what everybody thought was impossible, Dyn going down, down went Dyn. So with Dyn going down, like 5% of the Fortune 500 companies and big cloud service providers like Spotify, Twitter, Amazon were also down because they hosted their naming services with Dyn. Yeah? So here you see a classic story of collateral damage. Dyn was attacked, but it was a collateral damage that actually brought down the whole internet, and that made this incident so big. Now, in November, Deutsche Telekom had this attack with TR64 or TR69 exploit, 900,000 modems affected. And not so long ago, there was a Windows version of Mirai coming in, not actually to use a PC to do DDoS attacks, but more to search for new devices and new recruits. So it was actually like a hub that scans. The problem with Mirai today is that when it scans on the internet, it only can attack public devices. If a camera is installed in the house, and there's some kind of firewall or ACL filtering to prevent incoming connections, it cannot reach that camera. Now, when you infect a Windows PC inside the home, then suddenly you can start scanning for cameras that are inside the home, and you create a much bigger market for yourself, a number of devices that you can use for DDoS attacks. So you can clearly see that those other 10 attack vectors from Mirai clearly built to do DDoS attacks. Now, Hajime. Hajime was discovered a couple of days after, or better, a couple of weeks after the release of the source code of Mirai. And it uses the same exploit to get into devices. Now, it was 5 days before the Dyn attacks. So when Rapidity Networks, the two researchers from Rapidity Networks, discovered Hajime and reported on it, 2 days later, a couple of days later, Dyn got attacked. So it was lost in the news. Nobody was talking about Hajime anymore. Until a couple of weeks ago, and suddenly it came back up, and I did a report on Hajime, and also there was Kaspersky bringing out a report, Symantec did a report on Hajime, because we're all concerned what it's doing out there. It's supposed to be good. So what Hajime is, it uses the same infection vector, infects the device, and takes hostage of the device. It closes the ports, so the typical telnet connection port, the TR069, vulnerability, it closes all that ports and secures that device. And even on the screen, you see this message, just a white hat securing some systems. Yeah? So it's supposed to be a good thing, but at the same time, it keeps hostage of those devices and building a big command and control network. And that command and control network is much more sophisticated than the Mirai one. The command and control is using BitTorrent with trackerless info hashes, and also uses encryption on top of that to update itself. So it can update itself. It has an extension module that currently only scans and tries to find new victims, doesn't do any attacks, but it can update itself in a matter of a day. And according to Kaspersky, today we have 300,000 of those devices across the world that are infected. So they are sitting there, taken hostage by Hajime. We don't know what the goal of Hajime is. Even if it looks benign today or good today, it might be malicious in the future. Or if a hacker takes those encryption keys, is able to steal or crack the encryption keys of the command and control, he can take control of that botnet and do attacks. Now comes on BrickerBot. So during my research on Hajime, I suddenly see a whole lot of sequences coming in from somebody trying to break me. And before I go there, I want to talk about PDoS, so permanent denial of service attack. We all know DDoS. PDoS already exists for a while, but it came back in good fashion with BrickerBot. So when you look at DDoS, in DDoS you have service that is available, and during the DDoS attack, that service will be unavailable. That's the idea of a DDoS, bring down a service. Now, when you stop the DDoS attack itself, the service will come back, typically. With a PDoS, you have a service, you do the attack. After the attack, the service doesn't come back. And typically, it's a short-term attack. It's just a single. You launch a couple of commands, the device is out, and needs manual restoration or manual intervention to get it back up. So it's actually like breaking the device. You can have different levels of PDoS. If you look a little bit at the history, the first PDoS that was reported was in June 2008, was called Flashdance. That's why sometimes they refer to PDoS as a flashing attack. But in this case of BrickerBot, it's not a flashing attack. This was actually penetrating into a device using a vulnerability to change or reflash the firmware of the device itself. That's not what BrickerBot does. We will see in a second. There's also another PDoS attack known as USB Killer. And if you go to usbkiller.com, you can buy those devices for €50 or $50 online. And that's actually a small USB stick, looks like normal USB. But when you plug it in, it's loading a couple of capacitors and then in a very short term, send a high voltage into your motherboard and fries your motherboard. Just basically fries your PC. So when you find a USB stick in an envelope sent to you, or when you find one on the floor, think twice before you put it in, because you might be bricking your PC. And with bricking, I mean this one is really destroyed, no recovery. Now, BrickerBot, it's the first IoT PDoS botnet that we saw there. So I found it the first time in March. We will come back how I saw it and how I found it in 2017, so this year. It targets poorly secured IoT devices. Now, poorly secured, I have to say, it targets compromised IoT devices. That's something I found out later. So a couple of weeks ago, did a new blog on that. It's not targeting or actively scanning for devices. It's actually only breaking devices that are already compromised by either Mirai or Hajime. You'll see in a second how it does that. The reason that it's out there is to prevent IoT devices to be used in DDoS armies. So what it does is actually, it listens on the internet, and when it finds a bad device, it just sends a string of commands to it to break it. And at the end, the owner of the device is there with the broken device. Now, the guy who did this all is called the janitor, and a couple of weeks after reporting on BrickerBot, and through the press that it made with BrickerBot, the janitor came out of hiding, and we will come back to that story, but the janitor is actually the author of BrickerBot. So he is the one who built BrickerBot, and the reason he did it, and he called it internet chemotherapy. So he said the internet is sick, with all those IoT devices being infected, being used for massive DDoS attacks, and normal measures do not get us anywhere. So he started building that BrickerBot to actually take very active measures by just breaking the ones that are bad. That's his idea behind BrickerBot. So BrickerBot 1 was in March 20, and in a time period of 5 days, I got 1,895 of the same sequences coming in my honeypot. And you see the sequence. It's doing an fdisk to find out what are the file systems on my BusyBox system, and then it tries to corrupt any flash devices. So you see with the BusyBox cat defu random to MTT block 10, for example, that is just taking a stream of random characters and overwriting flash block devices, pseudo block devices with those characters, actually corrupting the file systems. Now, most of the file systems, especially the ones that run the code, might be read-only and protected. Yeah? That's why there's more of those file systems that he's targeting. At some point, he will find the small piece of file system where all the parameters and variables are put for the camera, and that's enough. After reboot, your camera is broken, because the camera was not designed as such to recover from corrupted parameters. So you're not actually corrupting the firmware, no, but when you corrupt that parameter field, it cannot boot anymore. Now, if that would not work, there are some fallbacks. So he's deleting the default route, which means no internet connection anymore. Also, he's putting in, through the sysctl command, he puts TCP timestamps to 0, so disabling TCP timestamps, which makes actually internet communication very slow. And then at the end, if that does not work enough, he will set the number of kernel threads to 1. Typically, for an ARM device, number of kernel threads is about 10,000. So you can see the impact on performance that it will have if you put the number of kernel threads to 1. It will be really, really slow. So slow that it's actually not booting anymore. So, and if all this is done, he will try to halt it or reboot it. Whatever happens, your camera will not come up anymore. Now, a couple of weeks later, I saw a very similar attack, but much more aggressive, like 1,293 attempts in a period of 15 hours. Very similar, again, patterns of corrupting file systems, doing that fdisk trunking. I did not explain the fdisk trunking, but that fdisk minus C1, H1, S1, it's truncating the number of cylinders and heads of old disk geometry, but now we have pseudo devices looking at flash, so it's actually truncating the flash to one sector. So just basically erasing all content that comes after the first sector. Yeah. So I saw this attack, very aggressive, coming in. Now, at the same time, so for those attacks, those were performed by a limited number of devices that were sitting on the clear net. And when I looked at the devices, they were all IoT devices. They were all like wireless bridges, wireless directive antennas, typically devices that you put somewhere on the ceiling of a building to do wireless communication with another building across the city that everybody forgot about. They were not updated in firmware. They were running an old version of a secure shell daemon drop beer that was known to be vulnerable. So those are typically the devices that the janitor is using to infect with BrickerBot. So it was always a limited number of devices that was attacking me with like 90 attacks per device. So each IP address, each source IP address had exactly 90 attacks. Some had 180, some had a little bit less because maybe I missed one because I had so many attacks coming in at the same time. Not sure. But it was always a limited number of IPs and a fixed number of attacks that it did. This will be important to understand how it works later on. Now, at the same time, so these were the ones from the ClearNet. Easy to find the source IP, you know exactly from where it comes, you can identify who is attacking you. Now, at the same time, I also had like lots of attempts, much slower. So they came in like every once per hour, but also much longer, and from all kinds of IP addresses. And I found out that those IP addresses were actually Tor egress nodes. So that was actually a service running somewhere on the deep web and using the deep web to conceal itself and doing attacks from the deep web. So not only has he devices running by compromising IoT device on the ClearNet, but he also has some servers running in the deep web who's trying to attack specific targets. Now, those coming from the deep web had some other commands in there. There was a fork bomb in there. Typically, what I think, more attacking honeypots. So if he thinks that this might be a honeypot that's out there, he's trying to break the honeypot. You can see it because he's not using the busy box in the command sequence. Yeah? And the honeypot, if you set up a honeypot that is a general Linux, built as a general Linux, those commands might work and might break your honeypot. And at the same time, there was also a report from Palo Alto reporters about a malware that was detecting honeypots and breaking honeypots. Yeah. Now, we actually took that for the test, because I told you most of the file systems are read-only. How can it impact? Is it enough by just sending random bytes? So we actually took the test. We were pretty sure that it was going to break, but we wanted to do it anyway. So my colleague in the US did a test on his camera, and after running the test, it was broken. Yeah? So it was not accessible anymore. He tried the factory default button. Did not work. The only thing that he could do was send it back to the manufacturer, have it reflashed. Because there's no way of accessing the device through serial. Yeah? If you could get access to the loader and reflash yourself, OK, you could do it. But with an IP camera so cheap, typically there's no such thing. There are even cameras out there who cannot do an upgrade. Yeah? So you will not be able to do that. Now, imagine that this happens to you with your remote sensors in the field. So going back to the SCADA network, you have lots of remote sensors. An attack like this will have your logistics servers driving around for days or weeks or months, even years, to repair all those devices and manually flash them again to make them work again. And this actually happened. So once the janitor came out, a couple of weeks later, the same reporter, Katalin Simpanu from Bleeping Computer, who I worked with to bring it out to the press, he and Dan Gooden were the first to actually report on BrickerBot. But Katalin got in touch with the janitor, and then the janitor tipped him off, said, look into this case on what happened in SierraTel in California. So SierraTel is like a small DSL internet service provider in California, a local provider. And they got hit by BrickerBot. But they didn't know it. So at that time, that was about April 2017, and this was reported on like 2 or 3 weeks later. Yeah? So SierraTel started to having customers call them that they were disconnected from the internet. And they started investigating, and their modems were broken. So they had to bring in modem and swap the modem with a new one to repair the old modem. Now, at some point, there were so many customers coming in with modems that their stock of new modems was depleted. So they had to send back customers home without modem, without internet connection, asking them to wait 2 or 3 days until they got it repaired and can give it back to them so that they can restore internet connection. Well, afterwards, they already knew that during their press release, they already knew that they were under attack. They didn't know by what or who or how or why. Yeah? But afterwards, with this tip from the janitor, Catalin knew that it was actually BrickerBot that was working out there. And what was also reported there is that BrickerBot, and the janitor talks about plan B. So what the janitor actually does, he tries to secure an IoT device. Well, that's what he said. I didn't see the proof of it because I did not really have actual IoT devices being attacked by him, but he says he tries to secure it. And there is some evidence that he's scanning for different kinds of ports, that he's opening an SSH channel, he's opening telnet channel. So he's trying to do some things, and if it fails, he goes to what he calls plan B. Plan B for brick. Yeah. So he said that apparently SierraTel network was infected by some kind of botnet, Mirai or Hajime or another, and that's why they got bricked by BrickerBot, which also made me think, how does he know that this was actually compromised or infected by these things? So here's the janitor. So the way that the janitor was found was actually an anonymous tip. So based on the article from BrickerBot from Catalin, somebody on the internet saw in hacked forums that there was somebody replying. So one guy asked, I am sure that one guy said that he might have found the source code of BrickerBot. And this guy, who calls himself the janitor, says, I'm pretty sure that this is not true. This is a rumor, because the source code sits on my desktop. If it would have been leaked, I probably would be in jail already. So an anonymous guy tipped this off to Catalin, and Catalin went to research, came to me, we looked at it, and when you look at his different posts, he only had 4 posts. He joined very recently, only to look at what the impact was of his BrickerBot on Mirai people and IoT DDoS people that were out there. So he wanted to see what is the impact of that. So he had a couple of posts. One of them is, how dead is Mirai? And he said there already, I have killed over 200,000 devices, IoT devices on the internet that were infected by Mirai. Nobody took him up for serious at that point, really. There was also 2 posts about Dahua password leak. So he had actually some very good research on how to reverse engineer and break the Gen 2 and Gen 3 Dahua cameras to get their passwords. And actually fairly technical. The janitor says that he's not in IT, but I'm not sure. He's fairly technical. And his English is very well written. He doesn't use the slang as the typical skids or script kiddies that are out there on hack forums. He doesn't talk about WTF and so on, yeah, all the typical slang. You don't see that happening with the janitor. Janitor is clean English, nice English written. So and when Catalin reached out to him, he said, yes, I am the janitor. So, and he said, like many of you out there, I'm not happy with what's happening right now. We see DDoS attacks performed by IoT devices. The IoT industry made insecure devices, makes a lot of money on them, and does nothing to prevent them from taking part in armies of DDoS attacks. And DDoS attacks can be harmful, but also ransom DDoS attacks and so on. So it's being used and abused for lots of bad things. So he was not happy with that. So he said at some point, I needed to do something, and he called it internet chemotherapy. Yeah, that's where the title comes from this presentation. So, and he said that the internet was becoming seriously ill Q2 and Q3 last year, so something needed to be done. And that's why he built BrickerBot and he attacked those devices. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I found out how BrickerBot actually works. So, BrickerBot will only attack infected devices. Remember that when Mirai or Hajime is infecting a device, it's scanning for new victims. And when it finds a new victim, it will first try to do a telnet brute force or TR069 exploit. Yeah. That is what BrickerBot is listening for. So he has a couple of IoT devices across the world that are listening. The SYN scan, no, he doesn't take any action on SYN scan because there's lots of robots out there and some scans happening, so he's not going to counterattack on a SYN scan. But if he feels that somebody is poking him on the telnet port, just as a connection on the telnet port, he disconnects. 2 seconds later, bang, BrickerBot is there, 90 attacks from the device that you just poked. So when you poke a device, it comes back with 90 attacks. So it's just sitting there, passively listening, and that way it can filter out and cherry pick only compromised devices and break those compromised devices. So if your device got broken by BrickerBot, don't be angry to the janitor. Be angry to yourself or to your manufacturer because you were already compromised by Mirai or Hajime. Now, might be also a little bit very drastic in action to actually break the camera. Yeah? Also, it might be dangerous because breaking a webcam is one thing, but if you start to break IoT device that may be in the medical sector or used for somebody's life, it might be more dangerous. So I scanned the internet very carefully, slowly, yeah, and found out like 230 devices out there. This is a geographic map, and it's when you compare it with Hajime and with Mirai, you will find very similar maps where the locations are. So typically where there's lots of IoT devices that are unsecured. One of the parts is Brazil. Brazil has a lot of IoT devices out there that are unsecured, cameras that are put on the internet with default passwords and so on. So about 230 devices that do that. So some closing thoughts. So Mirai is the bad. So Mirai is the actual weapon. So using IoT devices, weaponizing them into armies of DDoS attack weapons. Hajime is the good one, as far as we know, for now. Yeah, can change. Yeah, but there's a big threat out there. So we are closely monitoring it. About 300,000 devices, according to Kaspersky. Yeah, that's a lot. Very sophisticated. If you compare it to Mirai, Mirai is very basic, very easy. But Hajime, much more sophisticated. So it keeps those devices hostage and keeps that command and control channel open to be able to do anything he wants to do at some point. Its true purpose still a mystery for most of us. BrickerBot, that's the vigilante. He prevents IoT devices to take part in DDoS attacks. So whenever they are infected or compromised by Mirai or Hajime, BrickerBot will try to break them. That's why I said in the beginning, if you put a camera on the internet 2 to 3 minutes before it's infected by Mirai or Hajime, a couple of minutes later, it might be bricked, depending on how far BrickerBot was able to get. So how can you protect yourself? Well, first of all, protect yourself against known IoT threats. Don't put your IoT devices or your camera directly on the internet. And if you put it on the internet, do some firewalling there. Make sure that telnet is not open. Yeah? Also go look at the manufacturer's CLI, look for default password, look how to change those default password. Some cases it's not even possible to change the default password because they're in a read-only file system. Yeah? Not so nice, but it happens. Upgrade firmware. So actually, IoT manufacturers are taking action and are providing firmware updates. Yeah? And if they don't, the FTC is out there because they started earlier this year, January. They brought D-Link to court because they said that they secured their cameras, but they still found lots of vulnerabilities. So there's actually some court cases going on to make it better. So it's getting better. So update frequently. And if you are infected, what can you do when you are infected? Well, the nature of those Mirai and Hajime is as such that it's not persistent. It doesn't install itself in the file system. Well, it does, but it removes itself to hide itself. So when you reboot, it's actually gone. But to remember, if you reboot and you don't secure or reconnect to another secure segment of your network, you will be reinfected 2, 3 to 5 minutes later. So there you have it. Any questions?
Do we have some questions for Pascal? I was a little confused. You said Hajime does some protection of the target, but obviously not enough protection to prevent BrickerBot from being effective. Or does it stop BrickerBot?
I think it does stop BrickerBot. I did not test taking a Hajime device and actually having BrickerBot attack it, but I think it will stop it because it's blocking port 23, port 7345 for the TR069, and also some other ports. But at the same time, it's also removing a rule set called CWMP, which is typically used for WAN management. So it's used by the ISPs and put in there with specific ACLs. It's also removing that. So that's a little bit strange that it actually removes a rule. And it's opening other ports for itself to be able to create that BitTorrent network. And it even has some code in there that does UPnP IGD. So you know the UPnP protocol that can create a hole in your firewall to allow out or incoming connections to your device, something that we made to make the life of the consumer easier. Yeah. Well, it also has code for UPnP IGD, so to punch holes in your firewall and allow traffic in from your firewall. So it's good, but at the same time, I feel like there's a couple of bad things out there. Also, the extension module, when it first was discovered, it was called EXP, from experimental. Now it's called ATK. I don't know what ATK stands for, but could have a guess.
Any other questions? Do you have any additional information about what BrickerBot has bricked beyond cameras? You mentioned cameras. Are there other types of devices you've seen it brick?
Well, we saw it brick modems in the Sierra Tel. So, and the janitor says he bricked about 2 million devices. I'm not sure about that number. It seems to me that it's a fairly large number. But even if it's only 5% of that, that's a lot of devices. So, mostly devices that have Telnet open and that are running Linux BusyBox will be affected for sure. So that makes any device that's compromisable by Mirai. And most of them are cameras, DVRs, modems, routers, wireless access points, and actually the devices that the janitor uses to host or to run his BrickerBot itself are all wireless access points, wireless directive antennas, devices that at one point in time had a default password, and always from the same vendor. I'm not going to name the name of the vendor, but always from the same vendor, and the same default password at some point in time, outdated firmware, outdated SSHD, and that's what he's using as a platform to run his bots.
You know, one of the reasons why we put this on the agenda was if you look at some of the results in Shodan and some of the capabilities of PLCs, or I'm sorry, some of the PLCs and other devices used in control systems, building control systems and such that are available to be found on Shodan, you could create a PLC BrickerBot, quite easily. They can be found, they can be compromised, you can upload your own firmware and you can brick them. So we're just fortunate that no one has chosen to do that yet. But yeah, it could be exactly the same type of attack.
Typically, if you look at the history of malware research and malware attacks, the malware researchers find something and it takes like an incubation time of 2-3 months before you see an actual attack happening. So BrickerBot might be the first one who uses it for good, but you might see in 2-3 months that maybe somebody is starting to use it for bad, targeting industrial control systems, SCADA systems, other kinds of important systems.
It's some really good work. Thank you very much, Pascal.
Thank you.